Okay, so let's get going. Welcome everyone for what I hope is going to be a really interesting conversation. Just as a brief introduction to kind of what we plan or hope to do here today is that I think anyone who's familiar with Stalk will be very well aware that we strongly encourage and support openness, transparency, honesty in all aspects of the research process, from designing, conducting, communicating, disseminating. However, I think that no matter what way you approach science, there's no getting away from the fact that science is hard, and that no matter what approach you take, there are going to be challenges to be overcome. And I think open science approaches, while they bring a lot of potential opportunities, they also do bring challenges and difficulties as well. And I suppose the idea of today is that to have an open and honest conversation about what are these opportunities and challenges to engaging with open science. Thank you so much, everyone who's here. Aaron, Katherine, Sam, and Ciaran. We've got 5 different people all working in different areas, different career stages, geographically very spread out. And basically what we just want to do is have a chat about open science and, as I say, both the goods and the bad. Everyone, please feel very free to comment within the chat as we're talking. We will do our best, obviously, to open up to questions and comments from everyone. We would like this to be an open thing. So yeah, let's just get going. And I think to kick us off, I think what would be nice to just start out with is to hear from the panel here, what are your own personal what do you see as the biggest opportunity or benefit of engaging in open science practices? And maybe Katherine, would you be willing to kick us off there?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for having me on this panel discussion. I think it's a really important discussion to have, and I'm glad to see it being organized. So I approach this topic from my background as a qualitative researcher, which is a bit different from most folks who are approaching this topic of open science and open research practices. My research currently is both qualitative and quantitative. I use different methodological approaches. But when I came across the topic of open research practices, I immediately started thinking about what the implications would be for qualitative research, because there are a lot of complications when it comes to things like de-identifying data sets and sharing data, and what do we do with sensitive data and things like that. So that's how I got interested in it. And I think one of the greatest opportunities that I see is just the opportunity for greater collaboration and opportunities for education with greater access to methods and materials, and also to data. But I think we all know that as we were learning how to do science, having examples and seeing how things actually happen is extremely helpful. And so I think that idea of moving towards something that is more collaborative and that can support education and collaboration is something that I see as a great opportunity.
Awesome, thank you. Aaron, do you want to go next? I'm just going in the order that's on my personal screen, no particular.
Sure. Just as I think most people on this call know me, but I'm Aaron Caldwell. I'm a postdoc at the United States Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine right now as a physiologist. And, I just kind of see science as a very important public good. And I see kind of the open science movement as a way of leveraging changes in technology, really, to make that public good more useful. So I think that just pretty much sums it up for me right there. It's just, we have new tools, and I think the old way of doing things should be reevaluated. Yeah, I'll let everybody else speak.
Sam?
Great, thanks, Eimear. For me, in a really simple way, my main motivation is simply that I think engaging in open and transparent research practices just makes sense. So when I was an undergraduate student and first started consuming research, I always thought the almost secretive nature of research was really strange, the way aggregated data was reported in a paper and you just had to really trust how it got there. And I thought it was strange how much almost blind trust that we had in science, and actually outside of research, you would rarely place so much trust in something without knowing much more about the process. But I didn't know better, and I just thought that was how science was done. And then actually, as a PhD student, I wanted to get better at statistical inferences. So I did Daniel Atkins's course, online course, Improving Your Statistical Inferences. Many of us have probably done that on this call. And part of that course, learned how to, about engaging in open science, and things like uploading data and code onto Open Science Framework. And that showed me for the first time that actually science didn't have to be conducted in this black box, and we could actually be more transparent and open about our research practices. And I'm engaged in open science ever since. So I think that's just a convoluted way of saying that I think being open and transparent about research simply makes sense, and as cheesy as it sounds, it it aligns with my personal values.
And Ciaran? Thanks, Sam.
Yeah, kind of like Sam, my motivation came as a student initially. I spoke a bit about this before, but I started off in kind of like supplementation, performance research, and no idea what I was doing in just terms of pumping out papers. And especially when you're doing supplementation work, the likelihood that someone's going to contact you is very low. So this was just going out into the world, and I was like, cool, another paper. And I published a systematic review kind of halfway through my PhD in the area of exercise and cancer. And I got a letter to the editor a few weeks after it from kind of some of the big names in my field that I really respected. And they were just ripped to shreds. Like, it was sloppy work, and a lot of their comments were fair. But me as a, early stage career researcher or whatever, getting a letter like that, and then I had to see them at ACSM a few weeks later, I was mortified. And that was kind of a big kick in the arse that I needed in terms of switching my perspective of, it's not just the volume of shot you put out, it's more so, can I put stuff out that's respected by my peers for the quality and the rigor of its work? So that's kind of the big switch for me, where I turned more towards rigorous and open practices. But even then, it's taken me years to kind of get to a point where I'm still learning what and how that looks like as I build a career too. So to Katherine's earlier point, I think the biggest benefit is just the collaboration that we can get from it. And I think if all of us can kind of work on little circles to build, our students, skill set in it, we can kind of collectively raise the field as we move forward.
Thanks a million. I think, to be honest, after all that, I have very little to add, because just reiterating like Sam, what you said to me, my motivation to get involved or to work in this way is just that it makes sense. If we want to make informed decisions, we need all available information, irrespective of what that information actually, whether we like it or not. But I suppose one other thing, and I'm quite a newbie to all of this, like, it's really only in the last year or so since getting involved in Stork that I've kind of explored all of this. For me, there's at a personal level, there's a psychological benefit of just kind of saying, I've done my best. This is what I've done. This is what I think it means. Take from it what you will. I think it's quite nice to just put out your work like that and say, hey, I'm open to discussion, I'm open to feedback, and I think it encourages a more useful dialogue. So for me, actually, there's a psychological benefit of just going in that way too. Invite the criticism or open the criticism before somebody else does, and I think you can have a more useful conversation. But I think, as we said at the beginning, probably most people here are already quite convinced by the potential opportunities. But if we want to move forward, I think it really is important that we are open and transparent about the challenges as well, because otherwise we're not going to move forward. So I think that let's kind of do the same kind of round table in terms of people's main barriers or challenges that they faced or that they feel is involved. And then let's open up to a bit of a more open discussion as to how we can potentially overcome those barriers. All right, cool. Let's go in the same order. That's all right. Katherine, if you'd like to start us off.
Sure, thanks. The main barriers, gosh, there's several. It depends what level we want to look at. Some of the barriers that we might see are simply a lack of information or knowledge about how to proceed. And I found that working, so I'm an associate professor, and working with students, even in some of my courses, research methods courses, they might be working with faculty members who are unfamiliar with open research practices. And so I think that could be one barrier, is sort of swimming against the tide, so to speak, and that these it can be difficult to make those changes and not knowing where to start and where to begin. I think also stemming from that lack of information, lack of knowledge, is just that idea that it feels very overwhelming about where to start and how to begin with these things. And oftentimes when students and researchers are learning about open science practices, they're thinking about how they can apply it to the projects they already have going on. And there are some ways in which you can do that, but really it's more helpful if we start from the beginning of a research project and we think it through prior to submitting our ethics applications, because we have to talk to participants about informed consent to be able to share their data or use it in future research and teaching purposes, for example. So I think some of the barriers are figuring out how to implement it in projects that are currently underway, as well as planning ahead for the next projects that we begin with. So those are some of the challenges, I guess, with getting on board with or implementing open research practices. There's a whole other suite of challenges and issues with in relation to ethics and confidentiality and anonymity, and we can perhaps talk about those later. But I think in response to the question of how it can be challenging to get started with open science, those are some of the main barriers I see.
Thank you. I'm like jotting notes here, and there's so many things I want to chat to you about there, but let's carry on with everyone, and then we'll have more of a chat. Aaron, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it would boil down into kind of like 3 prongs for me, which is, one is the incentives. You know, I talk to more senior people than myself, people unaware who maybe are even at the same level, and their question is why? Why would I burden myself with extra work? Why would I do this extra thing? Well, like the biggest thing is just like, well, I don't want people looking at that, because they could criticize it. So it's even just a career advancement thing. So I don't think there's much incentive at all right now. It's almost none. Maybe slightly more than a couple years ago with, you know, NIH requiring more trial registration and posting of data. So like a little bit, but there's really no reason, I think, for a lot of people to start adopting it. So the culture needs to change. I think it's also a lack of resources, which I think just boils down to money. So one of the things I see now is, you know, talk about data sharing. Honestly, I think universities need to start hiring, and research institutes need to start hiring data archivists, whose entire job is just putting data away to be used in the future in a public way. Because I've seen a lot of open data sets, and a lot of them aren't curated very well. So, you know, we may want to be open, but, you know, actually getting something to the point where it's open and usable for somebody else takes a good amount of time and work for the researcher, and we're already very short on time to do that type of work. So I think it's going to take institutional investment in these things. And then I would even say overall, it's a lack of community buy-in, or I wouldn't say lack of, but there needs to be more community buy-in. Just so everyone's aware, I'm heavily involved in STORC and the executive committee, and I pretty much run the whole technical background for our journals and support archive. That contributes 0 to my career within where I'm currently located and my civilian path forward for tenure and promotion through the Army. This is something I've volunteered my time to do. And I think for a lot of us that maybe are beating the drum on open science, we kind of, you know, volunteering means volunteering. And to me, I consider it charitable work. And I think we need more people who will put in that time and investment, even though there may not be incentives for your career to do so. If you believe in these things, and realizing that's more of a volunteer activity, not necessarily a career activity or a work activity. There's so many things in there. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I could use help in all of these initiatives. If you want to see these things improve, it's going to require some of our own work, and maybe some work above and beyond what our jobs would entail. So those are just my initial thoughts. I'll let somebody else go.
Nice, thank you. Sam?
Thanks, Eimear. In my experience of talking to colleagues and peers about open science, the biggest barrier is that it opens people up to criticism. and the fear of being called out, or whatever you might call that on social media. I know I've used the term publicly shamed before, and I think I just read a book basically, and that term stuck with me. Yeah, that's you probably John. I think it's John Ronson, wasn't it? That wrote. So you've been publicly shamed. And actually, it made me think a lot about academia, and I think the majority of people I've spoke to about this sort of typical open science practices about uploading. I know it's not just about that, but uploading data and code and things, is the fear of being wrong in their analysis and then being called out and criticised for it, and essentially then feeling they, I guess, have sort of been put down as as an academic. Personally, I think the biggest barrier which is hard to deal with sometimes, is a complete lack of reward. And I know, Vanessa, I've just seen you put this on the chat about trying to get open science practices into promotion criteria, and a lack of sort of recognition and reward. So, for example, a few months ago, I applied to the Academy of Medical Sciences Springboard Award, which is in the UK. It's an early career, quite a prestigious early career award. And the questions that were asking, bearing in mind that you had to be, I think, within 3 years of your first independent post or something like that, and not have received so much funding, was tell me about your esteem. How are you esteemed? And I was like, how is these questions getting asked? This is an early career researcher, grant application, and there was nothing on there whatsoever about, how do you see sort of your science moving forward, and how do you see, what do you think is important in terms of practicing science and those sorts of things. So it was all about esteem. So if we tried to really push to, I don't know, be some sort of associate editor or something on a journal and allocate time on that rather than doing open science practices, potentially, that's a way to progress, however you define progression in a career. And so I think a lack of reward in the sort of system is a real barrier.
Cheers, Sam. Yeah, they're huge points there that I think are not going to be easily overcome, but hopefully we can chat a bit about it. Ciaran?
Yeah, I don't know how much original ideas I can add to what's already been said. For Sam's point on the criticism, to me, like, I'm not necessarily bothered about that, because I've had criticism for my work being sloppy. I'd rather be able to put work out there that people can identify, here's the mistake, because you were so transparent about it. And, you're seeing more and more people start to retract different things, and you kind of look up to those people who are able to own that mistake as opposed to hiding it or whatever. James is a great perspective of someone who's involved in a lot of that work earlier on. So for me, the criticism is not a bigger barrier, but similar to Aaron, I'm in a pre-tenure position at an R1 university in the States, and the pressure is immense. And for me, one of the barriers is building these practices within myself, and as I start to build a team of researchers around me that are competent enough to make sure they're accurate and all the rest of it, while also progressing. Because I'd go as far as to say that the time that it takes to do open science and rigorous work is not even less a barrier, it's almost a risk if you want tenure, because people will warn you against, like, why you spend all that extra time? Like, it's volume. And I'll speak for myself, but like the volume of grant applications that are requested for us to go out to external sources, it is a windmill of things. You're just chucking stuff out, and then the vague nature of tenure and promotion packages leave it to your own subjective nature of like, well, how much is enough? So I'm finding the balance of what's the minimum amount of volume that I need to progress, but also the largest amount that I can handle with quality and rigor. So it's a really hard balance to get right, and I'm not there. One of the other challenges I think in nature of that is like the projects I'm finishing up now were started 4 years ago when I hadn't got a clue what I was doing in relation to open science and rigorous work. So it's now backtracking on all of those. some of the ways I've gotten around that is kind of working with people who are a lot further along in this space than I am. And the likes of James and Ian Lahart, I have a love-hate relationship with that dude. He's a pain in your arse at times, but he's good at what he does. So keeping me on track and identifying my weaknesses. But I think the two barriers I would say is that within the constraints, not just the incentives, but also the pressure to forego those in trying to get a career or trying to get tenure and promotion, and then working with my own limits of my understanding of what open science practices and rigorous work looks like. So I have to pull in other experts to work along with me.
And I think we're starting to nicely segue now into the potential strategies to overcome challenges. Again, similar to the kind of first section, I have very little to add there, because you guys have really summarized what happened, what the main challenges are, and what you say really resonates a lot. When I was thinking about this, the one that I kind of came to was, there's a bit of a tangential anecdote. I was watching a movie. That movie, what's called He's Not That Into You, and the male lead is advising the girl on her dating life. And she says something that's one serious, like, so what, you're saying I should only date guys that like me and actually have respect and show interest? He's like, well, yeah. And she's like, but there'll be none left. And sometimes I kind of feel like that about my research ideas. I have loads of ideas, but if you say I should only pursue the ones that have a real meaningful contribution, that I have the power, resources, capacity to undertake, to be honest, the pool gets very small. I kind of feel like sometimes when you start pulling at threads of what is meaningful, what makes a contribution, it can lead you down into a bit of an existential crisis about what we're all doing with our lives, kind of thing. And that's something that I struggle with sometimes a lot, of kind of, I look at what I'm doing, I'm like, oh, but am I really powered? Could I definitely see this? Is the measures that I'm taking actually telling me what I want to know? And it just sometimes can feel a bit overwhelming to try to figure out how to be both open and transparent, but also to have value on what we do and appreciate what we do. And yeah, that for me is probably one of them. But I think, guys,
Eimear, can I jump in there just to piggyback off of that? I feel the same way in terms of my confidence in my ideas now is so much lower in terms of like, is it worth it? Is it going to be impactful? And that's another thing in terms of like, I don't have time to have that like time to think and pause and reflect. It's just like you have to keep going. And it's a huge thing that I struggle with, in that I'll come up with an idea and then I know that Ian's going to read it. And I'm like, no, there's no point doing anything. You know what I mean?
But
It's
that's
really
the thing,
hard to
you can
figure it out.
freeze. You can end up freezing, because you're kind of like, if I'm only going to do things that are going to be really like, the question that I sometimes really ask is, how can we both simultaneously reduce and increase value and expectation? As in, stop trying to sell every single study as if it's changing the world, but start to value small imperfect contributions. Like, how can we stop letting the great be the enemy of the good, and just be okay with doing quite good stuff that contributes a little bit?
I find that hard with even grants now, because, you know, you're talking about significance and impact. I'm like, I don't know. You're all right. Like, it's not going to change the world. A few people might get fitter. That's about it. You know what I mean?
But if you say that, you don't get it. But then you read the application from someone else, and you're like, oh, well, hold on, my idea was better than that.
Yeah, if we just chime in on that, Eimear, just some an anecdote on that. I completely agree. I'm trying to go for funding at the moment in more sort of basic sciences to look at some mechanisms underpinning physical activity and cancer risk. And the way our sort of funding team want me to sell it is, you know, because it's to basic scientists and they'll be on a panel, that it'll, you know, might lead to development of exercise mimetic drugs and things like that. And this is the significance how, you know, they want me to sell it. And I think, no, it's not going to. You know, that's not going to happen. You know, but I end up putting it in, you know, because that's the sort of advice I've got into, you know, that's the best chance it's going to get funded. But and so here I am, you know, saying that I agree that we should always sort of recognize the uncertainty in what we're saying and not overstate our effects. But I'm doing the same, you know, I'm almost still playing that game in the grant application. So I find those two really difficult to balance.
Yeah, but like, if you don't play the game,
I wonder if I can just jump in, because I'm thinking
Absolutely.
about how all of this can connect back to open science practices. And I think one of the things that I've seen as grant reviewer and seeing policies that are coming out that are related to tenure and promotion is that there is increasing attention to these issues, and they may take some time to trickle down, but that they are being recognized as important. So our grant applications require researchers to be engaging in these things and following policies that adhere to open science practices. And in several hiring discussions, those are discussions that are going on about the extent to which researchers are familiar with these topics and are engaging in them to some extent. So I think it's important to think about how the things that we're doing here can also be helpful in supporting your best practices. And perhaps those are things that if you're getting, people who are providing letters of esteem and reference letters and things like that, that's something that you can mention for them to include in their letters, that you are working on these things that is at the forefront of the field in these open science practices. And I think one of the other things that I'm mindful of is that while it might feel like there's a small core group of people who are working in this area and doing these things, and although it does take a lot of time, I'm aware that there are policies coming down where the default is meant to be open, in the next few years, and that we, to some extent, won't have a choice, and that will require more resources, and that faculty members can then, lobby for those resources to be able to make research open by design. But I think we're moving in that direction, so it's going to become non-optional at some point. And I think we need to be thinking about how we can move in that direction. So that's why I think all of this discussion here is really important. But just to say, I don't think that that you're at a disadvantage by doing these things, for those of you on the call.
I think that's why it's really nice to have both among the panel and among the audience here. We do have a range of people in different positions, different levels, different disciplines, different countries. And I think it's so nice to hear that there are a lot of, at a more organizational levels, incentives are starting to come in, or probably there in a lot of places. But yeah, so guys, I think we have so much that we could potentially unpack here, both in terms of conversation or both in terms of chat, the things that have already been said. Does anybody have anything they'd like to jump in with or comment on in relation to what everyone else said so far?
Well, if no one's gonna, Sam, did you have something?
No, I just inhaled. So it was just inhale. You go.
Okay. Well, I think something I kind of want to talk about that's been going around in my head lately is, what do we think about the publication landscape and how open science, I guess, grapples with that? Because, I'm of two perspectives on it, which is one, like I mentioned at the beginning, I consider research and science a public good. We're investing in it in the billions of dollars, trillions worldwide through our governments. And therefore that information should be as widely and openly available to the public as possible, in my opinion. Two, we have a journal system that still very much operates like it's 1921 instead of 2021, where we're still issuing issues of journals that comes from an old day where you subscribed to a journal and you sent in a packet with your manuscript in it. And it just feels like that's not moving very quickly. So any general thoughts from anyone, or if you disagree with me, please speak up.
Can I ask a question, Aaron? I just want to clarify if we're thinking the same thing here. When you say all information should be available, I do agree, but I also sometimes, what I'm struggling with now is I'm just overwhelmed. Like, I'm trying to write a paper and, the time it takes me to write a response, another 10 perspectives have come out. It feels impossible to keep up. And I suppose a concern about, I still do believe we need vetting, and like the general public is not equipped or trained to, say, evaluate research articles. So if we just allow them out, is that what you meant when you say everything should be available? Do you think everything should be published, or do you still agree with vetting?
I would respond back to you. What's the vetting then? And who's the vetters? Who decides who the vetters are? And do we have a publication police then? Because this is the classic argument against preprinting, which, full bias, I help run Sport Archive.
Oh,
but to me,
I support.
Yeah, but to me, it just seems like a ridiculous argument because everything does get published now, period, full stop. It will find a place to get published. The most damaging things that have happened in, say, let's say the public health space have been published in places as high as the Lancet. So everything does get published already. So I don't understand why we need some publication police to decide what gets published. My opinion should be actually more that everything should be shared. Therefore, it's not that big a deal when someone on a scholarly server like Sport Archive or Med Archive or Sci Archive publishes something. It's just kind of like, yep, a scientist said a thing. And then I think journals' jobs, their role in that space is that they publish very few things, right? And then that actually elevates the idea of the journal, because then the journal is only accepting the best of the best. Maybe 10% of the research is getting published there. Now I think every academic is sitting here sweating in that idea because they're like, how do I get my publication record up, make tenure? Well, let's think about it. I think a lot of places are evaluating you and using publication counts because they want to see that you're actively active, right? And doing research and not just, have projects listed and can read what research you're doing to evaluate it on their own. So I think, if we move to that system where the best of the best is public, preprint everything, publish very little, then I think that that could be a sustainable system, but that's a long way off. And a lot of journals are going to have to change their criteria because let's be honest, a lot of editors, I think, still think now and accept articles now because they don't want to be mean to these authors, right? Because they know that their tenure and promotion is based on this. So they're like, oh, it's maybe not perfect, but they're going to have to publish it somewhere. And these poor guys are trying their hardest, right?
I'll just jump in, as I serve as an associate editor with a couple of journals and have been a reviewer, I've seen lots of papers getting rejected. So I feel like, I would push back on that, we feel bad for the authors. I often don't know who the authors are, or if I'm an associate editor, we might see, established names or even, junior researchers who are, their work is not getting through that easily. So I would just push back on that idea. Perhaps there are other journals where that might be the case, but I would hope that that's not the case with some of the top journals in kinesiology and in my field. So I'm just curious, Eimear, about what are the practices that are going to be most beneficial for researchers to engage in? I guess that's the one thing. Like, what are going to be the most high impact strategies or efforts for young researchers in particular to engage in most effectively? That's something I'm interested in hearing from the others on the call.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and let's move on to that one. But I just want to say, Ciaran, thanks. You've actually reorganized my scrambled thoughts on that a little bit and clarifying my own perspective. So thank you. But I think that's a fantastic segue into action points. Like, what do you guys think are the most effective strategies for us as a community to move forward?
I think for me, the two main things that I've tried to do is get involved. There's a few people have said, like, don't overwhelm yourself with it, because if you go all the way in at the deep end with open science and rigorous practices, it is really overwhelming. I can barely count past my fingers and toes. Like, trying to code and all the rest of it is a nightmare. And if I put that pressure on myself to be at a level of where Aaron's at now, it can be overwhelming. Whereas if I can get in touch with experts who are further along than me and help kind of bring me along and just kind of build those habits and kind of create that foundation. And I think the most effective way we can do that is training our students. I don't think, unless the incentives change, which they are from funding bodies and all the rest of it, senior academics, for the most part, I don't want to say senior, but people who are in or against open science are not going to change their mind. Whereas if we can work with people like when Sam was an undergrad and say, here's what's wrong with this closed nature of things, let's start to develop more open practices. I think that's going to be probably the most productive use of your time, because you can go, it's all not worth it, blow it all up and start over, but that's not practical. Yeah. So for me, one of the most practical ways is getting the earlier kids involved as soon as they can in those basic steps of developing rigor and openness and transparency.
And I think,
Sam, even just chime on there, I completely agree about having, that's the way forward really, to have this in the syllabus, I guess, for students going forward. And I don't know how many people are on teaching research contracts here, so who teach and develop modules and things, as I've been over the past sort of 18 months. And it's something that I've really wanted to do, but there's barriers to that as well. So there's, pushback about trying to embed, open science into modules when there's other, say it's a research methods module, you're teaching research methods in, say, a student's second year, and there's, supposedly so much to learn, and then taking up a lot of that syllabus with open science practices when people, academics don't place any importance on it, and they would rather know how to, they need to know how to run a t-test for the dissertation project and those sorts of things. It's been really difficult to actually embed open science into teaching, or that's been my experience anyway. Maybe it's because I'm, early career and fairly new to teaching, but I found slight pushback and hard in there. I try and embed it in little bits, like when you're have students appraise a paper. Some of the things that I'll get them to look at is, have they pre-registered it? Have they put made their code publicly accessible? But that's just touching on open science practices really, and I find there's still, in my experience, a lack of opportunity to try and embed open science practices in undergraduate degree programs.
I'll just jump in there and say, Sam, I really like that idea of like just sprinkling it in a few places if we're not able to have an entire section or module on it. I really like that idea, and using it in ways, so talking about pre-registration, when you talk about exploratory versus confirmatory type of analyses, I think that can be really helpful. And another piece that I think is really important, though, for students learning open research practices is also learning about the ethics of downstream risks to participants and, access and control of data. I just think that oftentimes we might understand the practices and figure out, what open science framework is and where we can store our files. But I think equal attention, or if not greater attention, needs to be paid on that fundamental issue of the ethical implications of all of these practices, both for the participants, but also for researchers, and thinking about things like equity and access to information. So I just think the ethical component needs to go hand in hand with the actual pragmatics and learning the strategies.
I think just to follow on it, Katherine, your last point, but the pragmatic thing I do think is very important to consider in terms of, I think it's so much easier to criticize than to offer solution or fix. And I think it's so important that students are encouraged to critically read. However, I think every time a student points out an issue with a paper or with an analysis or with pathway, the next question would be, all right, so what would you do about it? What would you have done? Because I think that if we go down the road of picking the flaws and everything, again, we just sitting around bitching about everything and not really moving forward. I think that we have to acknowledge, again, science is hard. And so there might be very valid reasons for issues in papers, in which case they should be discussed so that we can start to look for solutions, or there might be less valid reasons, in which case things need to be potentially pushed back on. But I really do think that exploring the reasons for issues is important, that it's not just a case of this is bad, go fix it in your own time and way.
I think I'll add this because I'm seeing a theme here, which is everybody saying open science is overwhelming, which is a little shocking to me, because I personally, learning this on my own, because there's no one higher up than me throughout my PhD studies and master's studies that was saying like, getting excited about this was all stuff I searched out on my own. And I would say to everybody on this call, feel how you feel, but don't feel necessarily overwhelmed, because doing some of these things is better than doing none of these things. If you can pre-register analysis on one study, but not another, that doesn't mean the other study's less worthwhile or isn't as informative. It just means you were able to pre-register one and not the other, right? And in some cases, pre-registration may not be valid or worthwhile activity for all studies. I've struggled to think of one, but it happens, right? And same thing with sharing data. There are plenty of clinical data sets I could think of where it's just impossible to share your data. Now, you'll hear me talk about all the time, share your data, share your data, share your data. And that's mainly because I know that out there right now, about 1.5% of all studies within kinesiology are sharing their data at all, period, full stop, any data whatsoever. This isn't even saying the data is good or actually matches what was presented in the study. So, I think from a lot of open science advocates like myself, way more of just like, I just want people to try these things. Like, it's just because they're not that widespread. Everybody in this room may be very aware of a lot of these open science practices, but I think the knowledge as far as the breadth of the field that understands what's going on is very small. And if you try any of these things, you are doing better than the vast majority of people. Yeah, so if you feel overwhelmed, you're okay. Because if you know about these things, you're doing better than most.
Just to jump in on that, Aaron, I can say I started learning about these a couple of years, probably last year PhD, and I still had a few years of postdoc ahead of me. And I found myself fairly restrained or constrained in terms of developing these methods because I was a student in other people's labs. And it kind of speaks to the idea that a lot more students now are learning about these and don't necessarily have the ability to implement them depending on what their PI or mentorship team subscribes to. Whereas I do feel a lot more freedom now in being able to implement some of these practices in my lab. And I think the recommendation for me in that line would be, you have the choice of either, well, I can't do them now, so I'm not going to worry about them. Or can you practice those things while you're kind of still in that space? And then when you get to a point where you have a little bit more freedom, then you can start to implement them more thoroughly.
Absolutely. And I think, again, that's probably, again, the kind of the shifting cultures and the bringing in more and more incentives. These things will become more, well, I hope, more and more commonplace, and accordingly easier and easier, you would hope, because they'll just be in there.
Yeah, if I can just add to that as well, I think or champions of open science could do a better job at making that clear, that you don't have to be a real expert in R or something like that and be able to code really nicely and upload, and that's all open science is. It can be really small things like we said here, so engaging in reporting or following reporting guidelines like consort guidelines or the consensus for exercise reporting guideline, or something like taking an anonymous picture of your methods. I think uploading that as supplementary information is helpful to see how being transparent about how the experiment was designed or set up, and those sorts of things. I think we could champion it better, that it doesn't have to be like all or nothing, and those little steps are important steps.
I think that's huge, so just essential, I think, of just kind of thinking of the small ways and not trying to look for perfection. But I think that brings us to what I thought was a really important point. So I think it was Ciaran mentioned it, or Sam, I can't remember who mentioned it. How do we approach this from the point of view of, all right, well, I started this study 4 or 5 years ago, hadn't a clue, looking back, not sure about it. How do you guys think we should approach that when we can clearly see an issue with our own work, but at the same time, we don't want to lose or waste several years? We still feel that the information has value, but we can see flaws. How do you recommend approaching that from kind of a communication point of view?
I think I kind of touched on this earlier, like again, this is pie in the sky, Aaron's utopia. So flaws, caveat emptor, these are things I think about while I'm brushing my teeth, right? Like, not things I've evaluated with a very keen critical eye. But my view is like, I think that information, you may have that flawed study out there, which has this critical flaw that really kind of gets you from critically answering the question. So it's hard to make a strong claim, right? And therefore it's going to be, I think, sometimes difficult to publish. I think that's why I like this idea of preprint everything, publish, like peer-reviewed, publish very little, right? And the idea being out there is that it's good to have, you may think like, why has no one done this before? And there's probably a dozen of papers sitting in someone's desk somewhere where they're like, that idea didn't work, and we don't publish it, right? A file drawer problem. And I think therefore having, those things out in the preprint, you can kind of be almost like an autopsy report in some cases, or it could be maybe hey, things worked, but maybe not as fully as we wanted to. And that's also why I think, grant review committees should allow preprints for that exact reason of like, it can almost work in conjunction with pilot work or be pilot work, where you say like, hey, we tried this once, it didn't really work, but from that study, we now know we can do X instead of Y. and will really, and that's why this work will be impactful, because it's the next big step forward that will really lead to scientific advance. I'd love to hear everybody else's opinions. And like I said, if you think my idea is crazy, let me know, because this is not something I've really shared with many people.
For me, Aaron, kind of somewhat in line with that, but more something that's kind of continuously come up over the last year as I've engaged in more open science folks is, I think the danger is people can always or almost fall into a default of assuming malintent when these things aren't in place. So for me, I don't think that not including these things, especially in this transition period now, doesn't necessarily automatically say that the researchers had malicious intent or that the study's shy. I think we need to be a little bit more balanced in how we're evaluating stuff that's coming out now as we're going through this process. When it is mandated 5 years, 10 years from now, I think we can be a little bit more critical, but I think the default can't be they're hiding something and the study's worthless because they're not, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Not to say that you are, Aaron.
No, and I want to be very clear. Like I see a lot of criticisms on like twitter.com in particular, like especially stats criticisms, which is really funny to me, where people are like, it's terrible. And I'm like sitting there being like, it ain't bad, or it's not worse than anything else I see get published. So I don't know why you're mad about this one in particular. So I completely agree with you. And I tend to, or at least try to have a more positive outlook on the individual researcher and individual studies, and try to assume good faith on the side of the researcher. And my thing is I usually just try to like ask questions, or I send them emails. Like there's been multiple studies where maybe the wrong analysis was done, because you guys know I'm a stats nerd. And I'll send an email just being like, hey, really like the study, great idea, know exactly where your mind was going with that. Have you thought about doing this instead? Because there's this flaw in what you did. As far as being an open science advocate, I would suggest to everybody, we're going to attract way more bees with honey than with vinegar, right? And a lot of people are trying their best, but like Eimear said, science is so freaking hard to do. So if you come to somebody and, make it clear that like, hey, there are issues here, but come from a place of trying to help them rather than shame them, really, where that feels more like an attack, I think you'll get way more people to adopt better practices, do better things, have better stats analyses. Those are my 2 cents, at least.
I know it's a really good point, Aaron, because I know me, Eimear, and Rosie talked about this recently. We spoke about with Denver before about calling out on social media, and is there a calling out, or is there a proper way to go about that? And I think that's maybe a discussion for another time, but I think it's a worthy discussion. Is there an etiquette that can be developed that we could follow?
I wonder, I guess one of the things I want to note here is that for folks who are not on social media, probably not aware of a lot of these debates and discussions. So that also represents a very small community of folks within the broader science community. And so I'm not familiar with a number of the debates and people being called out from even other disciplines in kinesiology. I might be familiar with some folks in sport and exercise psychology, but because there's just been such a lack of open research methods to begin with, it's not happening that often. So I just think that like the proper methods and approaches for calling people out is to go through the journal, to go to the editor, to talk, like that is sort of our route that we should be, where we should be dealing with these things. And social media, I think, is a whole separate other issue. But I'm wondering, like, was your question, Eimear, to ask about what we can do now, like when we're 4 or 5 years into a study and we're trying to kind of go back and make our research practices open? Is that what you were asking?
No, well, sorry, what I was kind of thinking more is that if I kind of gotten to an end, if I was to start the study with the information and knowledge that I have now, I probably would have done things when I actually genuinely see flaws in my own research that I made out of pure ignorance at the time, just because I hadn't a clue, still haven't a clue. Like the best way to articulate those, as in, if it's a fatal flaw, fair enough, you probably shouldn't be publishing your research if you think it's not, genuinely not. But sometimes it's just like, well, to be honest, lads, I just screwed up.
I think to respond to that question, I think I would say starting with a data management plan. So there's templates online, you can fill them out, and that helps to think through a lot of the things and the challenges that we might run into, and also some sort of a pre-registration form, even if it's just for our own purposes. And I think that those are great for training purposes with students, because we can anticipate all of the ways in which we might handle our data, analyze our data. Perhaps you can share that with a colleague who can point out some of those fatal flaws for you. And, you know, even if you don't end up, if you do engage in other analyses beyond that, that's okay. It's important to just note that, and it does force us to think these things through. So those are the two pieces that I think I'm going to be doing with quantitative work. Pre-registration for qualitative work is less useful or helpful, but I think with quantitative work, data management planning and pre-registration planning.
Yeah, two huge things.
I completely agree. Everything that was just said, I think just from a personal journey kind of thing, going through the pre-registration process, like, and I mean, like, well, to be honest, through my own work, we have a ORQC office, Office of Research Quality and Management, and they essentially review your stuff before it's done, and like having to actually justify every little step and what you're doing, and everything really improves the work, because then you go, oh, wait a second, that doesn't make sense, like, or that won't work, or you're right, that isn't the best approach, and here's how we're going to improve upon that. Which is why I'll advocate for something else I like, which is why I think registered reports are a really good idea, and having the peer review process. Just I'm going to have my first one published here very soon. It's a meta science project, so not empirical physiology work necessarily. But that process was so much smoother because the reviewers came in and looked at it before we did the study, said, nope, change this, this, and this. You got to justify this, blah, blah, blah. And then when the results came in, they were like, yeah, looks good. Like, add this, change this here, but otherwise, great job. Like, you did exactly what you said you're going to do. And we trust these results are correct and well done. And so to go off Katherine's point, I think that's another way of kind of improving the research process, those registered reports, because you do identify a lot of those flaws. And let's be honest, I think the reviewers will even be more open to unanticipated flaws, because they're like, hey, that should be in the literature, because guess what? We didn't anticipate those flaws either, right? Most likely, I mean, there's other cases like equipment breaks and stuff. But yeah, those are my 2 cents at least.
Nice, I think, yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. Guys, I'm kind of conscious that we're starting to come up to the hour. I suppose, as we said before, we probably don't need to shut exactly on the hour, but we are approaching time. I have done a terrible job of looking at the chat because I've been kind of caught up in the conversation and I've been paying zero attention to the chat. So now I'm kind of seeing there's a lot going on there. I wonder, does anybody from the audience here, please feel absolutely free if anybody would like to comment on anything, on any of the points that have been raised here. There's some names that have come up, James, Ian, Rosie, Denver, you guys who are have been involved in a lot of these previous conversations. So please feel free to jump in if there's anything you'd like to comment on. And I think go for it, Rosie.
Oh, I've just got a quick comment, which is that Sam mentioned that we were talking about this recently, and I think some of these topics can be also had at the Stalk Summit. We've got various different types of sessions, and so if we think that one of these topics, one like a small one that's come up today, could be handled within a conference session, then please put in a proposal, because these are definitely the types of conversations, and then trying to come up with some steps forward. Just promoting the Stalk Summit.
Rosie, that's actually, I was meaning to do that and totally forgot. But yeah, guys, call for proposals are open now. And if you've any hesitation about, oh, well, I'm at beginning career, or oh, I'm not sure about it, forget about it. Don't worry. We want to hear all ideas and we will appreciate all suggestions and proposals. So please feel free to submit to that. And also something that's come up quite a bit, another shameless plug here, is for next week's session. Something that's come up a lot is about teaching and research methods. We're actually planning on developing a research methods textbook. We want to release it fully open access. We would want to invite contributors with specific expertise to really give the state of the art in each particular topic. And we'll be looking for contributors and we'll be looking for feedback. We're at the early stages and we have an open planning meeting next Wednesday, that everyone is very welcome to come along, and we'll describe our ideas so far and seek feedback. So I really hope that could potentially be a resource that we can all use. So two plugs there for upcoming Stork events that I think really align with what we're talking about here. Denver, go for it.
Yeah, I just have a quick comment or a question to pose to everyone, really. And having joined a new department within the past term, I'm proposing a intro to open science as a graduate level course for my department. And it kind of fell on deaf ears when I brought it up to the chair, who said, you know, this might not be something worthwhile of a full course. Maybe this is just, you know, a quick webinar. I was like, it's not really something quick that can be done as a webinar. There's a lot of steps to it that could warrant a full course. I'm just curious how other people have sold this to their department or faculty or college, and try not to be selling open science is the only way to do things, but a good way that we can move to improve the science that we're currently doing.
I'll hop in on right away. I think Vanessa may have a comment as well. Honestly, I wouldn't even necessarily sell it as an open science course.
Yeah.
I would maybe call it an advanced research methods course or a professional like I think we had a class at Arkansas called that you could like an elective you could take called like the professoriate, like research development, like Colton research development. And it was essentially just more about like, you know, how to be a professor with a research profile, right? And all of those kind of inside baseball kind of things, right? And I think the same thing could be said for like open science practices. You could have like an advanced research methods course that talks more about how do you have, you know, curate good data sets? How do you do pre-registrations? When are pre-registrations necessary? When are they legally necessary? Say like with a clinical trial, things like that. All of those things that we don't necessarily talk about at that 10,000 foot view in the intro research methods course. That's my initial thought, at least.
So I'm just going to jump in. So we do a Mythbusters course where a lot of this stuff, as you're learning to search the entire literature and then assessing each paper you're going to use, all of these things can start to come in. And now I'm thinking that we'll make like an intro to research matched with the Mythbusters. And almost that package will not say OA or open science in the title, but it's all there. And that might be a way to kind of circumvent the, you know, everybody's interested in Mythbusters and all the, you know, you can sell that, I think, in a much more fun, friendly way for those who are not immediately excited about open science.
I think looping back to the point that I believe it was Ciaran made earlier, I think sometimes sprinkling it in a lot of different places might be more useful than potentially going for the full course initially. So maybe that webinar just to introduce ideas and then following up with dedicated session on different practices. Kind of like today, we've talked about so many things, but
I think
we could obviously have a session on each one.
With methods courses like that, I wonder if there might be an appetite for it as something that's a cross-faculty course that students from multiple faculties could take that would benefit them in some way. So we have a center here for critical qualitative health research where students can take a number of methods courses and get additional certification in qualitative methods. So I could see something like that being quite useful if there is a methods center within the university that they might offer it as part of their suite of courses. So it's a great idea, Denver. So good luck with it.
Yeah, I'll add that that's what the University of Arkansas does. It's a course offered through the graduate school. Now, mind you, it didn't cover a lot of that, but it could have. So I completely agree. Across campus or department or college would be great.
Mayor, guys, I'm going to suggest that let's formally wrap up and summarize our conversation now, because I'm conscious that some people maybe just had the hour set aside. And then if anyone wants to stay on the call to chat for a few minutes after, we can carry on. But just to wrap up the session, I think it would be really nice if each of the panel members, well, first and foremost, thanks so much, guys, for coming along. I really enjoyed this conversation. And in terms of future events and sessions for the summit, I think there's so many things that we need to dig deeper into that we kind of touched on today. So thanks so much for participating and giving your input here. However, I think just to wrap up this particular session, let's go with a quick fire top tip from each of the panel members for the benefit of people who are kind of considering getting more involved. what would you recommend in terms of a top tip, first start, action point, piece of advice? What would you recommend? Let's reverse the order this time, just for the hell of it. Ciaran, do you want to go? No pressure.
Start small and just be as consistent as possible.
Nice, thank you. Sam?
Ciaran, you stole mine. Yeah, it would just be exactly the same. It would be, just know that open science doesn't mean you have to be super skilled at coding and data curation and those sorts of things. Take small steps. One example could be, follow a reporting guideline or something like that.
Aaron?
I'm going to take a different tact, which kind of maybe go big, but in a slightly different way, which is try new things. Because that's my biggest frustration with people is they're just like, nah, I'm not going to do any of these things. I'm just going to keep same old, same old. Try new things, try big, bold new things, because you'll learn a lot along the way. Just 3 years ago, I could barely code in R, and now I have like 5 R packages written, and I get emails every other week from somebody saying like, thank you, this is so helpful. Right. So don't be afraid to try new things. If you see a gap out there where you're like, we're not really doing this, or there's really not a tool for this, go make that thing, or go try to make that thing. And then you can tell people why it didn't work. And that will also be an important contribution. So that would be my piece of advice or top tip.
Nice. Thank you. Katherine?
Thanks. I think echoing some of the things we talked about earlier is an easy approach to start with some of these things is embedding it in student learning and student projects. And even if that's just having students adapt one piece of it, if it's pre-registration just for a directed study, they can teach you about what's involved with it, and you can look at it with them and learn with them. So I think embedding it with students learning can be really helpful for our own learning as well. They can do lab presentations on specific topics and educate your whole group. So I think just echoing the comment to start small and embedding it with student learning, I think can be a really great way to boost the resources within your entire lab.
And I think I was trying to think about this and my advice or thought would be almost to take a step back and think, like, what's your why in the first place? Like, why are you doing a research project? If the point to your research project is to prove what you already know, or sell a product, or get followers on social media, well, then maybe there's easier ways to get followers than going through research. If your why, if what you want is to actually just get a little bit closer to the truth and figure out fun stuff, well, that perspective kind of changes. Things like unexplained variation becomes a fun mystery rather than an inconvenience. So I think maybe just taking a step back and thinking, what are we actually trying to do here? And cute animal pictures, of course, is always a good movement forward. Guys, as I say, we can probably wrap up. Nice. We can probably formally wrap up there, but of course, as always, we can, whoever's available can get on with your day, and whoever's free can stay on to chat. But does anybody else have anything that they'd just like to close with? Any final comments or? So I'll close with a couple of reiterating a couple of plugs. Elections are open. Come join us. We're fun. Don't worry if you're just getting started. We're all figuring it out as we go along, but elections for co-chair and publications chair are open now at the moment. So please consider putting yourself forward. Call for proposals for the summit. Please mark the diaries for this June next year. I think it's starting to shape up to be a really exciting event. So really hope to get the opportunity to meet some of you guys in person there finally. And finally, next week, we've got a discussion about an open access research methods textbook that I think could potentially follow on from a lot of the things we've talked about today. There's a lot that we could probably embed there. So please feel very free to come there. We're at the early stages. We want feedback. This is our pre-registrations phase where we're looking for advice now. So we'd really appreciate seeing you guys there and hearing your feedback. So I think we can probably stop the recording there. And yeah, thanks so much to everyone for taking part.